July 3rd, 1969, midnight. Brian Jones floats face down in his swimming pool at Cotchford Farm. The man who founded the Rolling Stones is dead at 27. The police call it an accidental drowning. Case closed. But here's the problem. Nothing about that night makes sense. The witnesses can't keep their stories straight. Evidence disappears. And 40 years later, a builder named Frank Thorogood confesses on his deathbed that he murdered Brian Jones. This isn't a conspiracy theory. This is a murder that was buried for decades. And I'm about to show you exactly what happened that night. But before we dive in, if you love dark stories from rock history, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel because we're just getting started. Let me take you back to 1962. Brian Jones is a young blues fanatic in London, obsessed with American rhythm and blues, and he has a vision. He wants to create the greatest blues rock band Britain has ever seen. He places an ad in a music magazine. Mick Jagger and Keith Richards answer. Brian names the band after a Muddy Waters song, the Rolling Stones. For the first few years, Brian is the leader. He's the most talented musician, the most charismatic performer, the face of the band. He plays guitar, harmonica, sitar, dulcimer, anything with strings. He's a musical genius, but there's a darker side. Brian is fragile, paranoid, insecure. He drowns his anxiety in alcohol and drugs. And as the Rolling Stones explode into superstardom, something shifts. Mick and Keith take over. They start writing the hits. Brian becomes obsolete. By 1969, he's barely in the band anymore. He shows up to recording sessions wasted, can't play, can't function. Mick and Keith freeze him out. They don't fire him officially, but everyone knows he's done. On June 8, 1969, Mick Jagger and Keith Richards visit Brian at his home, Cotchford Farm, a beautiful estate in Sussex where A.A. Milne wrote Winnie the Pooh. They tell him he's out of the band. Brian doesn't fight it. He's too broken. 3 weeks later, he's dead. Here's what we know for sure. On the night of July 2nd, Brian throws a small party at Cotchford Farm. There are only a few people there. His girlfriend, Anna Wåhlin, a Swedish model. Frank Thorogood, a builder who's been doing renovation work on the house. Janet Lawson, Frank's girlfriend. And a nurse named Jenny who's visiting. They drink, they smoke, they swim in the pool. Around 11 p.m., Brian decides to go for a late night swim. Anna says she warned him not to. He'd been drinking heavily, mixing alcohol with prescription downers. But Brian ignores her and dives in. Frank Thorogood joins him in the pool. The two men swim together for a while. Then Anna and Janet go inside to make coffee. When they come back outside 10 or 15 minutes later, Brian is floating face down at the bottom of the pool. Frank pulls him out. They call an ambulance. The paramedics try to revive him, but it's too late. Brian Jones is pronounced dead at the scene. The official cause of death? Drowning by immersion in fresh water under the influence of alcohol and drugs. Death by misadventure, accidental. But here's where the story starts to fall apart. First, the autopsy. The coroner finds alcohol and prescription drugs in Brian's system, but not enough to kill him or even knock him unconscious. Brian was a heavy user. His tolerance was sky high. The levels in his blood were not lethal, so why did he drown? The coroner says his liver was enlarged from years of drinking, which could have caused him to pass out suddenly in the water. Maybe, but it doesn't explain everything. Second, the injuries. Brian's body had unexplained bruises on his shoulders, arms, and back. The pathologist noted them but didn't investigate. Were those from someone holding him underwater? Third, the witnesses. Their stories don't match. Anna Wåhlin originally said she was inside for 10 minutes. Later she changes it to 5. Then she says she saw Frank and Brian arguing in the pool before she went inside. Frank Thorogood says no argument happened. Janet Lawson gives a completely different timeline. And the nurse, Jenny, disappears entirely. No one can find her after that night. She was never formally interviewed by police. Why? And then there's Frank Thorogood. Brian had hired Frank months earlier to renovate Cotchford Farm, but the relationship had soured. Brian was notorious for not paying his bills, and he owed Frank thousands of pounds. Frank was furious. In the weeks before Brian's death, neighbors reported hearing the two men screaming at each other. Some said they heard threats. One witness later claimed Frank told him, "Brian will never see the end of this summer." But the police never followed up. Frank was questioned briefly and released. No charges. Case closed. For 30 years, the story stays buried. Brian Jones drowned. End of story. But in the 1990s, cracks start to appear. A journalist named Scott Jones, no relation, begins investigating. He tracks down people who were at Cotchford Farm that night. He finds construction workers who were doing renovations with Frank. And they tell him things that were never reported. One worker says Frank bragged about holding Brian underwater. Another says Frank told him, "I just couldn't take it anymore. They kept pushing me." And then in 1993, a man named Tom Keelock, the Rolling Stones' former tour manager, makes a shocking claim. He says the police investigation was deliberately shut down. He says Brian's death was covered up to protect the band's image and avoid scandal. He doesn't say who killed Brian, but he makes it clear it wasn't an accident. And then comes the bombshell. In November 1993, Frank Thorogood is dying of cancer. He's in the hospital and he knows he doesn't have long. His daughter is by his bedside. And according to Tom Keelock, who was also there, Frank confesses. He says, "It was me that did Brian. I just finally snapped. It just happened." He doesn't give details. He doesn't explain how, but he admits it. Murder. Frank Thorogood dies shortly after. No charges are ever filed. No investigation is reopened. The confession is dismissed as the ramblings of a dying man. But Scott Jones doesn't give up. He petitions the police to reopen the case. He presents new evidence, new witness testimony, new forensic analysis. In 2009, 40 years after Brian's death, Sussex police review the case. They look at everything: the autopsy, the witness statements, the confession, the evidence. And in 2010, they issue their conclusion: insufficient evidence to reopen the investigation. Brian Jones's death remains officially an accidental drowning. But here's what we know: Brian Jones did not accidentally drown. The evidence doesn't support it. The timeline doesn't support it. The witness statements don't support it. What we know is this: Brian was in the pool with Frank Thorogood. They were alone. Minutes later, Brian was dead. Frank had motive. He was owed money. He was angry. He had threatened Brian. And 24 years later, on his deathbed, he confessed. So why wasn't he charged? Because by the time the confession came out, Frank was already dying. Because reopening the case would have meant dragging the Rolling Stones back into the spotlight. Because it was easier to let Brian stay buried. The man who founded the Rolling Stones, the man who gave Mick and Keith their start, died at 27 under suspicious circumstances, and no one was ever held accountable. Anna Wolin, Brian's girlfriend, has spent decades trying to get justice. She wrote a book about that night, claiming Brian was murdered. She's given interviews, pushed for investigations, demanded the truth. But nothing changes. The official story remains. Accidental drowning and the Rolling Stones? They barely talk about Brian. Mick and Keith have given a few carefully worded statements over the years, expressing sadness, calling it a tragedy. But they never push for answers. They never demand the case be reopened. Maybe they don't want to know, or maybe they already do. Brian Jones was buried on July 10, 1969 in his hometown of Cheltenham. Hundreds of fans attended. Mick, Keith, and Charlie Watts were there, standing in the back, saying nothing. 2 days later, the Rolling Stones played a free concert in Hyde Park, dedicating it to Brian's memory. Mick Jagger read a poem by Shelley and released thousands of white butterflies. It was beautiful. It was theatrical. And it was the last time the Rolling Stones publicly honored the man who started it all. Brian Jones became a footnote, the founding member who couldn't handle the fame, the tragic cautionary tale. But the truth is darker. Brian Jones didn't just drown, he was silenced. And for 40 years, no one cared enough to ask why. If this story shocked you, turn on notifications so you never miss a video. And if you want more dark stories from rock history, check out the video I just dropped on the Led Zeppelin curse. You won't believe what happened. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.